Hello lovelies! Recently I came out with a video on the best fantasy tropes, and today we'll be talking about the worst fantasy tropes. Before we get started, remember to click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another video. I post every Sunday. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All the links are in the description. As usual, these tropes are my own personal opinion, which makes them purely objective. Please share your least favorite fantasy tropes in the comments, and if you know any fantasy books, movies, or shows that avoid these tropes or subvert them in a really fun way, please tell me in the comments so that I can check them out. Thank you! Number 1. You know what I'm gonna say here. Romantic subplots! Not every single story needs a romantic subplot. It's not the law. You're not gonna die or burst into flame if you don't add one. If your story does not benefit from adding romance, don't add romance. It's fine. It's not a requirement. This is especially true of love triangles. It's just cheap drama. No real people act like this. Maybe in high school, but that's because high school sucked! Unless you plan to kill off all 3 of those characters, don't write the love triangle. Number 2, chosen ones. As a writer, I understand the temptation. It's a quick way to launch your main character into the plot when otherwise he would have no reason to be there. Now there are a lot of creative ways to write the chosen one trope. You can have multiple chosen ones, or making it so that they're destined to do something bad instead of something good, or making it look like your main character is the chosen one, but it's actually somebody else. But most of the time, the chosen one is just a rebranded white savior. If it's a movie, the chosen one is a white guy. If it's a young adult novel, it's a white girl. Try to find a more creative way to make your substandard white person important to the story other than saying Destiny likes them. Number 3. The setting of medieval Europe. Think of a typical fantasy world. It's based off of medieval Europe. It is a fascinating part of history and a lot more complex than most people think it is. But it's just a tiny sliver of the world that we can use to base our fantasy societies on. Do a little research. Your fantasy world would be much more unique and interesting if you based it on literally any other culture. I guarantee you're gonna get a lot more like, ooh, this might be interesting, if you choose Imperial China, or Ancient Rome, or a Native American tribe, or the Aztecs, or somewhere in Africa, or wherever. We don't see enough of it. So when we do see it, we're immediately drawn to it. If you do end up using medieval Europe because you have a fetish for it or whatever, it's fine. Still do your research. Not all women were rape victims. African Americans were known to the continent for centuries. It's right across the Mediterranean. Same with the Middle East, and later Asia with the spice trade. It's not all white dudes in power. Number 4, the 90s anti-hero. I'm calling it the 90s anti-hero because it's that particular flavor that was super popular in the 90s, where they're all murder happy, trigger happy, basically rebranded villains. They're emotionally closed off. They usually have a tragic backstory. This guy just murdered a bunch of innocent people in the first chapter. Why am I rooting for him? Let's face it, him. These types of heroes usually show up as a male power fantasy. If this is the power fantasy for that particular guy, I'm staying away from him for my own safety. This hero should not be going on an epic quest to save the world that he hates. He should go to therapy. Number 5, the fridge family. This is an extension of the woman in the refrigerator trope. If you're unfamiliar, the woman in the refrigerator originated from a Green Lantern comic where he comes home to find that the villain has murdered his girlfriend or wife or whatever his romantic interest was and shoved her body into the refrigerator. Basically, the woman in the refrigerator trope is when the woman exists solely to be killed off to motivate the man to do the thing. These days, it's usually the whole family. This can be parents and siblings, or, more often, his wife and children. Look, not every single hero needs a traumatic backstory, and not every hero needs to be jolted into action purely for revenge. It could be something else entirely. You can give that family another reason to exist other than being killed off. Number 6, the racism. by which I mean there are no people of color in this fantasy world. My epic fantasy world is based on the Roman Empire, and they were all white Italians, so there can't be any people of color in my story or it wouldn't be realistic. So many things wrong here. First of all, there were several people of color in the Roman Empire. It's an empire. It spanned across southern Europe, the Middle East, and northern parts of Africa. Secondly, it's a fantasy world, based loosely on real life. You can have your fantasy world based off of ancient Iceland, populated entirely by people of color, and no one will care because it's a fantasy world that doesn't exist and probably includes dragons and shit. And if those people do care, you should ignore them because they're jerks. Some authors, like George R.R. Martin, will include people and civilizations of color, but they're barbarians and slaves. Not better. Give me a civilization where people of color are in charge. Give me a person of color who's the main character. Give me a person of color who's the mentor but doesn't die. Something. Anything. Come on. Number 7. The sexism. Everyone knows that women didn't hold any power or political authority before the 1980s. It wouldn't be realistic for me to have them be respected members of society in my medieval fantasy world. Again, fantasy world. You can do whatever the hell you want. Also again, do your research. While Western civilization has usually treated women like crap for the majority of its history, several indigenous tribes, parts of Africa, the Vikings, and several other civilizations actually saw us as people. And there are plenty of examples of women who worked around or through Western patriarchy to get stuff done. For a truly terrifying example, research Olga of Kiev. She's who George R.R. Martin based Daenerys Targaryen off of. For more, I'll link my video on the worst female character tropes in the corner. Number 8. The homophobia and transphobia. You guys are seeing a trend here, right? Everyone knows that gay and trans people didn't exist before the 1970s, and that every LGBT person is white. Research non-binary people in indigenous tribes and get back to me. Also, every time a gay person shows up in a science fiction or fantasy story, they're almost always killed off. I say gay instead of gay or trans because trans people don't show up in fantasy stories. They do show up in horror movies as the crazy serial killer, though. Number 9. The ableism. All bitching aside, fantasy authors have gradually gotten better about including women, people of color, and even LGBT characters in their writing over the years. Not fast enough, but I see the effort. I have not seen nearly as many characters with disabilities in fantasy stories, mental or physical. Sometimes you can get them in subtext, like Frodo from Lord of the Rings is usually held up as an example of someone experiencing a lot of mental illness after his ordeal. He's got classic post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. That's no longer good enough. It is never explicitly stated that Frodo is dealing with mental health issues. We get a pass on it because it's written in the 1940s, but you're not in the 1940s anymore. You can clearly say this person has depression, this person has anxiety, this person has OCD, this person has infantile paralysis, this person has whatever. You do not get to pull a Rowling and try to retroactively write inclusion into popular media. Write it in the story. Finally, number 10, the metaphor. The power to defeat the bad guy was inside you all along. No, we did not go through that entire adventure, 300 pages, of watching characters die, only to be told that the way to defeat the villain was with us the whole damn time. That would make for a pretty cool tragedy, though. Usually, when the author does something like this, they're trying to do an uplifting theme of confidence and self-acceptance, and instead it just gets a round of eye rolls. This is not to be confused with the character who knows that they have some sort of power, but due to some sort of confidence issues, they don't believe they can do it. And then after their darkest moment at the end of Act 2, they push through their issues and fully utilize their power. This trope is when the character has no idea they have such power until an elderly mentor character tells them near the end of the story, and then 5 minutes later they're throwing fireballs. If you're going to write a metaphor about self-love, try to be a little more subtle about it. That's it for now. Thank you for watching, and let me know what your least favorite fantasy tropes are in the comments. Remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss next week's video. I upload a new one every Sunday. If you want early access to these videos and more content, check me out on Patreon. The link, as well as all my social media, are in the description. Bye, lovelies!